He laughed at the man who fixed cars for a living, not knowing that, within minutes, that same man would teach him what real worth looks like. The city of Los Angeles shimmered under the afternoon sun, the streets pulsing with luxury and noise. Outside the Monarch Plaza, an exclusive five-star venue reserved for the world's elite, the air was thick with the low growl of engines and the scent of polished chrome. It was the annual Crown Motors Invitational gathering of millionaires and collectors, where status was measured not by handshake or reputation, but by the horsepower parked outside. Men in tailored suits leaned against sleek machines worth more than most homes. Women in shimmering dresses posed beside them, diamonds catching the sunlight. Every car gleamed a symphony of arrogance painted in metallic red, midnight black, and royal blue. And in the center of it all stood Daniel Whitmore. Daniel was the kind of man who believed charm and cruelty were the same thing. He had built an empire of luxury car dealerships across California, and with every dollar he earned, his sense of superiority grew louder. He didn't just own wealth, he wore it, spoke it, breathed it. That day, he was wearing his favorite accessory, arrogance. Beside him, guarded by velvet ropes and admiration, sat his prized possession, a crimson Ferrari F40, vintage, untouched, and broken. The kind of car that could make grown men whisper in reverence. Daniel raised a glass of champagne, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "Gentlemen," he said, tapping his glass, "this beauty here is worth more than most of you will make in a lifetime. Unfortunately," he smirked, "she doesn't run anymore." The crowd chuckled politely. Daniel continued, pacing beside the car as if on stage. "I've had 3 top engineers from Italy try to bring her back to life. Not one of them succeeded. She's a beauty, but like many beautiful things in life, she's fragile." Laughter rippled through the crowd. At the back of the gathering, unnoticed and out of place, stood Elijah Brooks. He wasn't wearing a suit. His shirt was faded, his hands were rough, and a smudge of oil still clung to the edge of his sleeve. He had been hired by the event's cleaning crew, not as a guest. He was there to wipe floors, carry crates, and make sure that men like Daniel Whitmore never had to see the dirt that made their luxury possible. But Elijah wasn't looking at the guests, he was looking at the car. The Ferrari F40 wasn't just a machine to him. It was a memory. His father had been a mechanic. The kind of man who could rebuild an engine blindfolded, who used to say, "Machines have souls, son. You just have to listen to them." Elijah had listened. And now, as Daniel boasted and the crowd laughed, he could hear it, the silent whisper of an engine that didn't need a miracle. It just needed someone who cared. Daniel's voice broke through the noise. "I'll tell you what," he said, grinning. "If anyone here can make this car run, they can have it." The crowd gasped. It was the kind of arrogance only the very rich could afford, a dare thrown out to prove superiority, but no one stepped forward. Until one voice cut through the laughter. It was calm, deep, and sure. "Mind if I take a look?" The crowd turned. All eyes landed on Elijah. The man holding a rag in his hand, wearing work boots and a worn-out shirt, had just spoken in the middle of the elite. Daniel's smirk faltered. "Excuse me," Elijah repeated. "Mind if I take a look at the car?" The guests began whispering, amusement rippling through them. Daniel laughed, the kind of laugh meant to humiliate. "You, my friend, this isn't a Toyota in some back alley. This is a Ferrari F40. You wouldn't even know where to start." Elijah met his gaze without blinking. "Maybe. But you said anyone, didn't you?" Daniel's eyes narrowed. "You're serious?" Elijah nodded once. For a moment, Daniel studied him, weighing his options. The crowd was watching. He could tell the man to leave and risk looking afraid. Or he could turn this into a show. And Daniel loved a show. He smiled, slow and cruel. "All right then. I'll tell you what. You make this car run, right here, right now, and it's yours." A murmur swept through the audience. Daniel raised his voice, feeding on their energy. "I mean it. If this man, this janitor, can make my Ferrari start, I'll hand him the keys myself." Laughter exploded around them. Phones came out. Someone began filming. But Elijah didn't flinch. He walked toward the car, slow and steady, his boots clicking softly against the marble floor. When he reached it, he didn't touch it right away. He crouched beside the hood, tilting his head slightly, listening. Daniel crossed his arms. Oh, this should be good. Elijah ignored him. He studied the Ferrari like a surgeon studies a patient, not with arrogance, but with respect. His hands moved across the body of the car, feeling the metal. The warmth of the engine bay. He whispered under his breath. You've been asleep a long time, haven't you? The crowd exchanged puzzled looks. Daniel scoffed. Talking to the car now? You really are something. Elijah smiled faintly. You have to talk to her if you want her to listen. The laughter grew louder. But Elijah didn't hear it. He was already working. He popped the hood and peered inside. The crowd gasped as his rough hands brushed over gleaming metal. To them, it was sacrilege. A poor man touching a millionaire's treasure. But to Elijah, it was instinct. He adjusted a wire, checked the fuel line, pressed his ear close to the engine. He could tell immediately what was wrong. It wasn't complicated. It never was. Whoever worked on this, he said quietly, treated her like a machine. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Isn't that what she is? Elijah looked up, his eyes steady. That's the problem. 5 minutes passed. The crowd grew restless. Someone whispered, he's bluffing. Another said, he's just pretending. Daniel smirked. Had enough, my friend. Elijah didn't answer. He closed the hood, wiped his hands, and stepped aside. Try it now, he said simply. Daniel blinked. You're done. Elijah nodded. She's ready. Daniel laughed, but his hand still reached for the key. He slid into the driver's seat, turned a hand. The sound that followed silenced the room. Roar. The Ferrari came to life with a thunderous growl, its engine revving like a heartbeat that had finally returned. The crowd froze, phones trembled in hands. Daniel's jaw dropped. The laughter vanished, but Elijah took a step back, his eyes calm. You just have to listen, he said softly. For the first time, Daniel had no words. The man he had mocked had done what his best mechanics couldn't. And as the Ferrari purred behind him, Elijah turned, picked up his rag, and walked away. The sound of the engine followed him out the door. A roar that drowned out every ounce of arrogance left in the room. The roar of the Ferrari still vibrated in the glass atrium, long after Elijah stepped back from it. But Daniel Whitmore wasn't ready to surrender his stage. Humiliation has a way of clawing for oxygen, and Daniel, drowning in the crowd's sudden awe for a man he'd just mocked, reached for the only lifeline his ego understood, louder arrogance. He slid out of the driver's seat with a showman's smile plastered over a tightening jaw. Beginner's luck, he declared, lifting his champagne as if he'd planned it all. A fluke. Anyone could have rattled a loose connector. The smile didn't touch his eyes. Cameras moved in, a hush spread, not reverence for Daniel, but curiosity about the man in coveralls who stood quietly by the rear fender. Hands folded, gaze steady. Elijah didn't answer. He didn't need to. Daniel circled the car like a ringmaster. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not get carried away. A janitor jiggled some wires. She'll die again in 5 minutes. He looked straight at Elijah. Unless you're claiming you did something technical. A few nervous laughs flickered across the crowd. Status has gravity. People orbit it even when they know it's false. Elijah finally spoke, not to Daniel, but to the engine. She-hold, he said softly, if you stop treating her like a trophy and start treating her like a machine with a rhythm. Daniel barked a laugh. Poetry hour. This is a Ferrari, not a church hymn. Elijah's eyes lifted, calm, unblinking. That's your whole problem. A murmur rippled. A reporter leaned forward. What do you mean? Elijah wiped a smear of grease on his rag, then nodded toward the engine bay. Someone overtorqued the fuel rail, clipped vacuum routing, and cranked an idle screw trying to chase a hiss they didn't understand. You can bully a carburetor. You can't bully this. His finger traced air above the intake. These engines respond to balance, pressure, airflow, temperature, not pride. Silence. Even the AC seemed too quiet to listen. Daniel's smile cracked. Cute story. But you don't own the car, remember? He raised the keys for the crowd to see, metal winking under chandeliers. Let's talk about the bet. Heads turned. The bet. He had said it publicly. It's yours if you make it run. Everyone heard it. Phones had recorded it. A man near the velvet rope called, he started it, Whitmore. Another bolder, pay your bet. Daniel's face flushed, then smoothed. Of course, he purred, if our friend can repeat the performance. Right now, with a cold start, who'd closed in front of certified judges, he gestured, and 3 of his own judges appeared. Dealership techs in crisp, POLOS. Elijah met their eyes. No hostility, only a quiet recognition. Working people drafted as props, he nodded. Fine. Daniel clapped loudly, theatrical. Wonderful. Another show, but this time, hands off, unless my judges say you can touch. Elijah shrugged. I don't need to touch it. The line landed like a small thunderclap. Then, gently, he added, not yet. Daniel waved at his techs. They killed the engine. The expo fell into a hush, so complete that the valet bells outside sounded like distant wind chimes. Elijah stepped to the driver's door. Permission to sit. A judge glanced at Daniel, then nodded. Elijah slid in, settled like he was adjusting to the memory of an old friend. He rested his hand on the wheel, eyes closed for half a breath. When he opened them, the room felt different, steadier somehow. He didn't touch the key. He looked at the dash, listened to the soft tick of cooling metal. Then he pressed the clutch with a smooth, patient motion, and waited. Daniel smirked. What are we doing? Meditating? Elijah didn't look up. Listening. The judge nearest the hood frowned, curious despite himself. Elijah turned the key only to ignition. He watched the needles sweep twice, as the systems checked in. Again, he waited. When he finally cranked, he did it once. Cleanly. The engine caught, not with a scream this time, but with a low confident humph that settled into a restrained silky idle. Not a roar, a purr balanced, intentional. The judge, by the hood mouthed, perfect. The crowd didn't cheer. It exhaled. Something about the sound told them this wasn't luck. This was a musician tuning a Stradivarius with their ears, not their ego. Elijah eased the throttle, not stabbing, but teasing the line where the note turns from breath to voice. The rev rose and fell like a sentence with grammar. He shut it down gently, rolled out, and stood. He didn't look at Daniel. He looked at the 3 techs. Whoever last worked it fought a vacuum leak with idle and fuel, backed themselves into a corner, replaced gaskets, cranked force where finesse belonged. Next time. Smoke test before talk. The youngest tech swallowed. Then gave the smallest nod, the kind mechanics give when truth lands exactly where it should. Daniel clapped again, too loud. What an education. Are we quite finished performing? Parlor magic. He twirled the keys on a finger. I believe we agreed the car is yours if it runs. He leaned in, stage whisper smug. Tell you what, take the keys, if you can insure it, if you can register it, if you can afford to keep tires on it, or we can call this a fun demonstration and I'll wire you. He paused for drama, 10,000 cash. Today, the crowd shifted. A buyout, a bribe, a second humiliation wrapped as generosity. Elijah's jaw flexed once, not at the money, but at the message. Know your place, he asked quietly. Is the bet changing? Daniel smiled like a man's saving face. The spirit of it is intact. I reward effort. A woman near the front crossed her arms. He kept his word. Will you keep yours? The phones drew closer. The room had stopped orbiting Daniel's gravity. Elijah broke the tension with a soft, unexpected chuckle. Keep the car. Daniel's head cocked. Pardon. I don't need your Ferrari, Elijah said. I needed you to hear it. Hear what? Daniel scoffed. Elijah turned to the crowd. Not to grandstand, but to share a truth that didn't fit on a spec sheet. Some of us were taught that machines deserve respect. You don't bark at an engine. You don't throw parts at a problem because you're impatient. You listen. You measure. You learn the person who built it what they wanted it to feel like. He looked back at Daniel. That's not just cars. That's people. Something in the room tilted a collective realization that the man in coveralls had just moved the story out of horsepower and into character. Daniel swallowed, the showmanship leaking out of him. So, you're refusing a car worth millions, and my cash? Elijah's eyes softened. There's a garage on 5th where I teach 2 kids after hours. They think nobody sees them. If you want to keep your promise, fund apprenticeships. Tools, bays, certifications. Not a photo op, actual hours. 10 slots. 1 year, the youngest tech blurted, "Do it." He caught himself, but it was too late. The truth had escaped. Cameras caught Daniel's face as calculation warred with conscience. For a painful heartbeat, he looked human, the kind that knows the right thing and is terrified of the cost. Elijah rescued him from the moment. "Or don't," he said, voice gentle. "But don't call it a bet if you never meant to lose." It wasn't a threat. It was a mirror. A slow clap started at the back. 1, then 3, then a wave. Not the explosive ovation from earlier, but a grounded, grateful sound. Daniel lowered the keys. He didn't hand them over. He didn't pocket them either. He stared at the Ferrari like a man hearing his own heartbeat for the first time and realizing he'd been breathing wrong for years. "Give me 24 hours, he said hoarsely. "Bring me a plan. Real numbers." Elijah nodded once. No triumph, no smile. "I'll email it tonight." They stood in a small, strange peace, a millionaire and a mechanic. The distance between them suddenly measured not by net worth, but by whether either could change. Behind them, the F-40 clicked and cooled like a living thing winding down after being heard. Finally, by someone who spoke its language. Outside, traffic rolled by, indifferent. Inside, the room had taken a side. It wasn't worship. It was respect, pointed in the right direction at last, and for the first time all afternoon. Daniel Whitmore didn't look like a man performing. He looked like a man deciding who he wanted to be when no one was filming. Elijah picked up his rag, tucked it into his pocket, and offered a small, steady nod. Not to Daniel. To the car rest, he murmured, "We'll teach him how to listen." Night settled over Los Angeles. Like a quiet confession, the glimmer of the city stretched endlessly from the hills, a constellation of ambition, greed, and sleepless dreams. And in a small auto garage on the east side, Elijah Brooks wiped his hands clean, the faint scent of motor oil clinging to him like an old memory. The crowd from the expo had gone home. The laughter had faded. The headlines had begun to spread, but for Elijah, none of that mattered. The world could talk about Ferraris and billionaires. All it wanted, he was back where he belonged, among bolts.engines. Silence that hummed with purpose. He locked the shop door behind him and turned on a single overhead lamp. It flickered once, casting a warm glow across the room filled with tools, worn but carefully arranged. Every wrench had a story. Every oil stain was history. On the far wall hung a photograph, faded edges curling. Framed in cheap glass, it showed a man with kind eyes and strong hands, his father, Isaiah Brooks, standing beside a rusted Chevrolet, both of them smiling, grease on their faces. Below the photo was an inscription in black marker, "Respect the work, son, because the work will respect you back." Elijah exhaled deeply. His father had been gone for over a decade, but his lessons never left. He remembered those early mornings, the ones that smelled of gasoline and pancakes. The garage door cracked open as sunlight spilled across the concrete. He was just a boy then, sitting on an overturned bucket, watching his father's hands move like music. "Listen," Isaiah had said, his deep voice steady as he adjusted a carburetor. "Every car talks to you. It's not just metal and oil. It's a heartbeat. If you don't listen, you'll break it. If you do, it'll trust you." Elijah had smiled, pretending to understand. But years later, when his father's hands grew too weak from illness to hold a wrench, Elijah realized what he had really been teaching: respect. That respect was what carried Elijah through everything that followed, through the poverty that forced him out of trade school, through the nights when he fixed cars under streetlights for neighbors who couldn't afford a mechanic, through the days he was told he'd never belong in luxury garages, because people like you don't fit the brand. He had seen arrogance dressed as expertise, he had seen pride pretending to be knowledge, and every time, he had answered it the same way with work. Elijah believed in work the way some men believed in prayer. You showed up. You gave everything. You left it cleaner than you found it. Now, as he stood in his small shop, surrounded by the ghosts of engines past, his mind replayed Daniel Whitmore's voice. You can't bully a carburetor. You can't bully this. That line, the one that had slipped out instinctively, kept echoing in him. He wasn't sure if Daniel had heard the truth in it, but Elijah had meant every word. He walked over to a project car in the corner, an old '67 Mustang, paint-chipped. It wasn't worth much, but it was his favorite. He'd been working on it with two young students, Marcus and Jaden, both barely 17. Both from the same neighborhood he'd grown up in. They reminded him of himself, hungry to learn. Tired of being underestimated, he opened the hood, checking the progress they'd made earlier that week. Their wiring was messy, but their effort was there. These boys got fire, Elijah murmured. Just need direction, he smiled faintly, and began fixing their mistakes, not because they'd failed, but because he wanted them to succeed when they came back tomorrow. Teaching them wasn't charity, it was legacy. A few hours later, his phone buzzed on the workbench. A message from an unknown number. He wiped his hands and opened it. I meant what I said. I want the plan for those apprenticeships. 10 slots, 1 year. Send it by morning. Elijah stared at the message for a long moment. He hadn't expected Daniel to follow through, not so soon, but maybe, just maybe, something had changed in that man. He typed back, I'll send it tonight. No publicity. Just opportunity. Then he set the phone down and looked around the small garage. A wave of quiet pride filled him, not because of the Ferrari, not because of Daniel's sudden conscience, but because of this place. This was where real change started. Not in penthouses or expos, but in small spaces where calloused hands met stubborn engines and made something run again. Later that night, as the clock struck midnight, Elijah sat at his cluttered desk, drafting a proposal. He listed tools they'd need, hours for training, and the cost of certification. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't beg. He simply laid out what was necessary for 10 young people to have the kind of chance he never did. Halfway through, his eyes drifted to the photograph again. His father's smile seemed to watch over him. You'd like this, old man, Elijah said softly. Yoey said work reveals character. He thought about Daniel, about the look on his face when the Ferrari had roared to life. There had been something in that man's eyes. Shock, yes, but beneath it, humility. The first crack in the wall of pride, and Elijah hoped, maybe that humility would grow into something lasting. Morning light began to creep through the garage. Windows. Elijah closed his laptop and rubbed his tired eyes. Outside, the first cars of the day hummed down the street, engines waking up to a new day. He stood by the open bay door, watching the sunrise reflect off his half-finished Mustang. The world would never see his name on a magazine cover. He didn't need it to. Some men chased fame. Others built legacy. And as the city stirred around him, Elijah smiled. He had built both, not in the eyes of the world, but in the hands of those who would come after him. The next morning, Daniel Whitmore sat in his office, a glass box perched high above Los Angeles. The skyline stretched endlessly. But today, it looked different. Smaller, somehow quieter. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that man's face, Elijah Brooks, the car mechanic who had made his Ferrari sing like it was reborn. He had replayed it over and over. The hum of the engine, the stillness in the crowd. The way Elijah hadn't celebrated or gloated. Just walked away. Daniel had built his entire empire on the idea that power demanded an audience. But that man? That quiet mechanic? He didn't need one. He carried his power differently, like something earned, not displayed. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his desk, his reflection fractured across the glass. He hadn't realized how long he'd been staring until his phone buzzed. It was an email from Elijah, subject apprenticeship, proposal body, 10 students, 12 months, tools, space, and mentorship. No publicity. No speeches. Just work. Attached was a simple PDF, detailed, honest, clear. Not a request for money. Not a plea for charity. Just a plan. Daniel exhaled slowly. There was something humbling about it. How straightforward it was. How unpretentious. He leaned back in his chair. He'd spent millions on sponsorships, PR campaigns, and philanthropy dinners. But this was the first thing that felt real. Later that afternoon, Daniel's driver dropped him off in a part of the city. He had never visited a worn-down industrial block where street art covered cracked brick walls. He stepped out of the car, his polished shoes clicking against the uneven pavement. For the first time in years, Daniel looked out of place. A small sign hung above a garage door. Brooks Auto Service and Training. The door was half open. The faint hum of an engine coming from inside. Daniel ducked under it and froze. The space smelled of oil, steel, and something oddly pure. No chandelier, no glass displays, just honest work. Inside, Elijah stood near a car lift, showing to teenagers how to align a drive belt. He looked up when he saw Daniel but didn't stop what he was doing. "Morning," Elijah said calmly. Daniel nodded awkwardly. Got your email." Elijah smiled faintly. "Good, you came sooner than I expected." Daniel stepped closer, scanning the place. "So this is it." "This is it," Elijah said, handing a wrench to one of the students. "Nothing fancy, but it gets the job done." Daniel walked around slowly, taking in the details, tools neatly arranged, faded photos of Elijah and his father on the wall, a stack of textbooks, mechanical theory, engine diagnostics, automotive design, covered in pencil notes. He stopped at the corner where an old Mustang sat, half restored, its hood open. "You're working on this?" Daniel asked. Elijah nodded. "Been teaching these two boys to rebuild it, Marcus and Jaden. Good kids." The teens waved shyly. Daniel smiled, uncomfortable but intrigued. "They're the first?" Daniel asked. "The first," Elijah replied. "If you're still serious about funding the program, they won't be the last." There was silence for a moment, the kind that feels too big to fill. Daniel finally said, "You really don't want recognition for this?" Elijah shook his head. "Recognition doesn't teach anyone how to live. Work does." That answer sat heavy in the air. Daniel's voice softened. "You sound like someone my father used to know." Elijah chuckled. "Maybe your father knew what work meant before you learned what wealth does." The words weren't cruel. They were true. Daniel looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, he didn't see a mechanic. He saw a man who had built a life out of broken things. Engines, people, maybe even himself. "Can I hear it?" Daniel asked suddenly. Elijah frowned. "Hear what?" "The car, the one you're teaching them on." Elijah grinned, handing him the keys. "Be my guest." Daniel hesitated, then climbed into the driver's seat of the Mustang. It was nothing like his Ferrari, rougher, heavier, more alive. He turned the key. The engine sputtered, growled, then steadied, not perfect, not polished, but real. It was the sound of effort, of hands that had worked late into the night. Elijah's students smiled as the Mustang idled. "That's her heartbeat," one of them said proudly. Daniel felt something stir in his chest. Not pride, not ownership, just respect. He looked at Elijah through the windshield. "You've built something here," he said quietly. Elijah nodded. "So can you, if you choose to." Daniel sat for a long moment, hands resting on the wheel, the hum of the old car filling the silence. He thought about his office, his empire, the countless people he'd dismissed because they didn't look the part. He thought about how hollow all of it suddenly felt. He turned off the engine and stepped out. "I'll fund it," he said. "All of it." The training, the tools, the certifications. No strings attached. Elijah studied him carefully. And the cameras. No cameras, Daniel said firmly. This isn't for them. It's for me. That night, the city roared with its usual noise, sirens, engines, the hum of neon life. But somewhere in the heart of it, inside a small garage on the east side, a different kind of roar filled the air. Not the roar of ego, not the roar of money, but the roar of truth, of redemption, of understanding, of change. Elijah stood by the open door as Daniel walked toward his car. Whitmore, Elijah called out. Daniel turned. Elijah smiled faintly. You keep listening like that, and you'll learn something even the rich can't buy. Daniel nodded. What's that? Elijah's gaze was steady. Peace. The following weeks brought a quiet storm into Daniel Whitmore's life. For the first time in years, he wasn't attending charity dinners or investor brunches. He wasn't posing for photos beside cars he didn't drive or making promises he didn't keep. Instead, he was showing up in jeans, not a suit, at Brooks Auto Service and training. 3 evenings a week, his arrival didn't go unnoticed. The first time he walked into the garage, carrying boxes of brand new tools, Elijah's students froze. To them, Daniel Whitmore was a name that lived in magazines, not in a shop that smelled of burnt oil and old paint. But Daniel didn't talk about himself. He just placed the boxes down, rolled up his sleeves, and said, Where do you want them? It was awkward at first. He didn't know how to hold a socket wrench, how to read an engine compression gauge, or even how to get grease off his hands properly. But Elijah didn't mock him. He let him learn the way every man should, through patience, sweat, and humility. On the 4th evening, Daniel's assistant, a polished man named Graham, showed up at the garage with a look of unease. Sir, he whispered, pulling Daniel aside, the board's growing restless. You've postponed 2 executive meetings and declined the investor dinner in Malibu. They're starting to ask questions. Daniel didn't look up from the toolbox he was organizing. Let them ask. Graham lowered his voice further. They think you're distracted, spending too much time here. Daniel smiled faintly. Maybe they're right. Graham hesitated. This is beneath you, sir. With all due respect, Daniel cut him off gently. That's the problem, Graham. I spent too long thinking everything was beneath me. He glanced across the room. Elijah was helping Marcus align a cylinder head, while Jaden checked torque specs. The laughter echoing off the walls wasn't the kind Daniel was used to. It was genuine, unfiltered. Daniel said softly. Do you know what I realized standing in this place? Graham frowned. What's that, sir? That for years, I thought I was teaching people how to succeed. He wiped his hands on a rag, his tone calm. But success without humility is just failure dressed in a suit. Over the next few weeks, Daniel's name began to appear in a new context, not in luxury magazines, but in whispers across the mechanic community. He was funding apprenticeships for low-income youth, sending used parts and equipment to small garages, and quietly paying off certification fees for students who couldn't afford them. He didn't announce it. He didn't even tell Elijah. He just did it. But change rarely comes without resistance. At a board meeting in his downtown office, the tension broke. Daniel, one of his senior partners, began, his tone tight. Your sudden philanthropic interests are starting to hurt our image. Daniel leaned back in his chair. I wasn't aware humility had a price tag. Another partner chimed in. The investors are nervous. You're spending company funds on community projects, training programs for street kids. It's not our brand. Daniel's gaze sharpened. Maybe it should be? You're risking the company's reputation. He smiled. No, gentlemen. I'm fixing it. The room fell silent. Then quietly, Daniel added, For years we sold luxury, the illusion of perfection. But people don't need illusions anymore. They need opportunity. A younger executive tried to soften the blow. But sir, with respect, this mechanic, Elijah, he's not your kind of people. Daniel's tone turned to steel. Then maybe I need new people. He stood, smoothing his jacket. If any of you think I'm losing my mind, you're free to walk out. But if you stay, understand this. The company's future isn't built on cars anymore. It's built on character. Back at the garage, Elijah was unaware of the firestorm Daniel had walked through that day. He was focused on the apprentices correcting, teaching, encouraging. When Daniel arrived that evening, he looked tired, but lighter somehow. Elijah noticed. Tough day? He asked. Daniel chuckled. You could say that. I may have scared off half my board. Elijah smirked. Half's a good start. They both laughed, and for a moment, the difference between them, money, background, upbringing, vanished. They were just two men standing over an engine, trying to make something run. Later that night, the group gathered around the Mustang as Marcus turned the key. The engine coughed, stuttered, then caught. The boys cheered. Elijah clapped them on the back. Daniel just stood there, watching the joy in their faces. He realized something he'd never noticed before. The sound of purpose was louder than applause. He walked over to Elijah. You were right, he said softly. About what? Listening. Elijah smiled. Took you long enough. Daniel's voice grew thoughtful. You know, when you made that Ferrari run, I thought it was about the car, about proving me wrong. But it wasn't, was it? Elijah shook his head. It was never about the car, Daniel. It was about what you'd do when it finally started. Daniel looked around the garage, the young faces glowing under the warm light. The laughter, the sound of that old Mustang, idling like a heartbeat. He understood now. This not the expos, not the money. This was what legacy sounded like. Outside, the night was cool and calm. Daniel stood by his car before leaving. Glancing back one last time, inside the garage, Elijah was still working, sleeves rolled, grease on his hands. Focused as ever, Daniel realized that the man he'd once humiliated had ended up saving him, not just from arrogance, but from emptiness. He smiled to himself. The lesson in worth, he murmured, wasn't about money at all. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore drove home, not as a millionaire, but as a man who finally understood value. A year passed. The sign outside Brooks Auto Service and Training no longer looked like it belonged to a small neighborhood garage. Fresh paint, new lights, a second bay door. And every Saturday morning, the sound of laughter and engines filled the air like a hymn to redemption. Inside, a dozen students, once just faces Elijah saw on corners or in shelters, now moved confidently between lifts and tool benches. Their hands, once hesitant, now carried purpose. Their voices, once unsure, now filled the room with talk of torque, pressure ratios, and possibility. And at the center of it all stood Elijah Brooks, his sleeves rolled, his face calm, his eyes shining with the pride of a man who had finally passed on everything his father had taught him. He looked up as a familiar sound echoed outside. The deep hum of a luxury engine. The garage door rolled open, sunlight spilling in like gold. A sleek black Bentley Continental stopped just shy of the bay. The door opened, and out stepped Daniel Whitmore, not in a suit this time, but in a plain shirt, dark jeans, and a smile that looked human. The apprentices froze for a moment. Some whispered, recognizing him from news headlines. But Daniel raised a hand and said, Don't stop. Keep working. He walked toward Elijah, nodding approvingly. Place looks different. Elijah chuckled. So do you. Daniel smiled. I guess we both learned a few things this year. They stood side by side for a while, watching Marcus and Jaden, the original two, show the new students how to bleed brakes. The rhythm of work filled the silence between them. Daniel finally spoke. You know, when we started this program, I thought I was helping you. Elijah smirked. And now? Daniel's voice softened. Now I realize you were helping me. Elijah turned toward him, his tone gentle. What made you see that? Daniel looked around the garage at the students, the tools, the smell of purpose that no luxury car could ever replace. I spent my whole life trying to build a brand that people respected, he said quietly. But I never respected the people who made it possible. You taught me that work has a soul. That dignity isn't something you inherit, It's something you earn. He paused, glancing at Elijah. And that peace isn't about silence or success. It's about knowing you've done right by others. Elijah nodded slowly. You've been listening, Daniel smiled. Finally, they walked toward the office. On the wall hung a framed photograph. The first group of apprentices to graduate under the new program. Below it was a brass plaque that read, "Funded by Whitmore Motors, built by hands that refused to give up." Daniel stopped to read it, a faint smile forming. "You didn't have to add my name," Elijah shrugged. "Didn't do it for you? Did it for them. They need to know that even the powerful can change." Daniel exhaled, humbled. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." Elijah shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. You gave them a future. That's enough." As they stepped outside, Daniel's driver pulled up with a covered trailer attached to the Bentley. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Daniel nodded toward it. "Something I've been meaning to return." The driver lowered the ramp. Inside sat a gleaming Ferrari F40, the same crimson machine that had started it all, restored. Perfect. Its body gleamed under the morning light, like fire made of glass. Elijah blinked, surprised. "You kept it?" Daniel smiled. "Of course. But I don't drive it anymore." He handed Elijah a single silver key. "It belongs here. Not in a glass showroom." Elijah stared at it, speechless. "You're serious?" Daniel nodded. "I am. It should remind them what they're capable of, that it doesn't matter where you start, only that you keep moving forward." The apprentices gathered, their eyes wide with disbelief, as Elijah gently turned the key in the ignition. The Ferrari came alive, its engine roaring across the street, not as a trophy, but as a symbol. This time, it wasn't a roar of arrogance, it was the roar of redemption. The students cheered. Daniel smiled, and Elijah, for the first time since that fateful day at the car expo, finally let himself feel the moment. He wasn't fixing something broken anymore, he was building something whole. As the engine quieted, Daniel turned to leave. He paused at the door. "You were right, you know?" Elijah looked up. "About what?" Daniel smiled. "You can't bully a carburetor? Or a man. You have to listen." Elijah grinned. "Took you long enough." Daniel chuckled, extending a hand. "For what it's worth, I'm still learning." Elijah took it firmly. That's the only thing worth doing. That evening, as the garage lights dimmed and the apprentices went home, Elijah stood alone in the doorway, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Behind him, the Ferrari sat silent, its surface reflecting the glow of a single hanging bulb, a reminder that even machines, like people, can find new purpose. He thought of his father, of the long nights, of every moment he'd been told he wasn't enough, and then he smiled. Because this was the proof. The world had seen a man mocked and underestimated. What they hadn't seen was what came after. The quiet triumph of integrity, and the peace that only comes when your work becomes your legacy. Elijah turned off the lights, locked the door, and whispered into the stillness. "Good night, old man. We made it run." He humiliated a mechanic in front of everyone, and ended up learning the lesson of a lifetime. Because no matter how much money you have, you can't buy respect, you can't buy peace, and you can't buy the sound of something or someone finally coming to life. If this story moved you, share it, because sometimes, the people we overlook are the ones who fix more than just engines, they fix us.